most inspirational lesson I ever had about resilience came from a dog. Little Rosie, what a sweetheart. She was 3 years old when she came to us, and her early life had been filled with trauma. She'd stayed with a shelter volunteer for 8 months in hopes that she could become sufficiently socialized that she could go to a forever home. We were the forever home, my son and I. But it wasn't clear from the beginning that it was all going to work out that well. Rosie was terribly afraid of everything. She barked at us for 20 minutes while we sat quietly on the sofa when the rescue volunteer introduced us for the first time. After that, she found a spot in a crate that was familiar, and she settled down. As the rescue volunteer left, she said, "Please, don't get your hopes up. I'm not sure you'll ever be able to pat Rosie on the head. She's that afraid." It was a challenge. It was a little daunting, but our hearts went out to this sweet dog who had never done anything wrong in her life except be the one who got hurt. The next few days went by, and sure enough, Rosie wouldn't let us touch her head. She found an oddly comfortable spot at the end of the sofa my son liked to lie down on while he was playing video games. Kevin has long dreads, and he hung them over the end of the sofa, and Rosie would crawl underneath the dreads. It was sort of a little cave that, I'm sure, to the dog, smelled like Kevin. And a couple days later, Kevin called me into the room and he said to me, "Mom, look at this." I looked. Rosie was standing in front of him, and he was patting her head, scratching her ears, telling her, "Who's a good dog?" 3 days. From never to 3 days. The power of love and connection to heal is absolutely astonishing. And that recovery from healing is what we call, recovery from trauma, that healing is what we call resilience. The ability after we fall, after something terrible happens, to get back up again and go forward with love and not fear in our hearts. One of my most formative experiences as a young adult happened at a reception during a legal conference. I was a young lawyer working with a much more senior lawyer, and we were both at this reception together. The senior lawyer, John, I noticed, was in a corner of the room, and literally, John was cornered. There was a woman standing really close to him and kind of pressing him so his back was against the wall. And she was sort of filling the space in a way that would have made it rude, if not impossible, for him to squeeze by her. And she was speaking to him very intensely with this great drama visible from far across the room, even though I couldn't hear a word. So I wondered what was going on, and maybe a part of me wondered if he needed a little rescue. And when I got there, I heard the end of the story that she was telling, and it was a sad story. She'd experienced trauma. I don't remember now what it was, because what I remember was the way John looked at her, and he listened, and he nodded, and he made murmuring sounds of empathy. And that was all he did. And then when she was done, he looked at me and said, "Ready to go?" I said, "Yes, I guess we should move on now." And we left. And I said to him, once we were out of the room, I said, "That was some conversation you were having." He said, "It was really important that you be able to talk to someone who would listen." so important and so formative for me as a young adult to see this accomplished, nationally renowned lawyer take the time for a complete stranger to listen, because it was really important that someone do that someone listen to her. We've talked about adverse childhood experiences before. That's another word for childhood trauma. And adverse childhood experiences is abbreviated as ACE. And the ACEs study, looking at various kinds of adverse childhood experiences and their effect on people's health later in life, has been around now for 15 or 20 years, and more science is coming to bear on the discoveries of what happens in the lives of people who have experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences. In any group, about 25% of us will have experienced at least one significant and adverse experience in childhood. And recently, some of us from this congregation went to a workshop on trauma-informed congregations. What a mouthful. But it was about how congregations can learn to be places that generate healing and resilience for people, which is at least a quarter of us, who have experienced trauma. And the study only looks at childhood trauma, and we all know we experience trauma as adults. If it hasn't happened to us personally, we've certainly known someone who's experienced something terrible. So that percentage isn't just a quarter of us, it's probably a lot higher. And the science that has been reaffirmed time and time again is that a traumatic experience actually causes changes in the brain. It causes the centers that generate fear and anxiety, the fight or flight amygdala of the brain. Those centers of the brain become more active after trauma, and they stay active unless there is some kind of healing intervention. And that is actually the good news, that subsequent studies have showed that there can be healing interventions even many years later. The focus, of course, is on preventing these adverse experiences, but gradually public health officials are beginning to understand that we can actually help adults heal from not only early trauma, but from the trauma that they may have experienced only 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And the intervention studies show that the brain can heal, the MRIs can change, that people can become fully healthy again. They can recover from trauma, that resilience is possible. And the most important finding of the new science about what kind of interventions work to help people heal and be resilient is that the relationship is the healing intervention. The relationship is what heals us. So, people who work in this area, public health officials, community leaders, are particularly interested in working with different community groups, including faith communities. And that's why we were at that workshop, because 10 of us were representing this faith community at the interfaith workshop. And the idea is that faith communities are an ideal place to begin creating, well, all right. To begin creating resilience-engaged, aware, and loving communities. Resilience-engaged. That we understand the need for people to become resilient. We understand that it's possible for that to happen through the relationships in our faith community. And we take steps as a church, as individuals, to be aware and loving in our interactions with one another so that we can have this real community, resilience engaged, aware, and loving. It spells real. Real community. So, based on the research, in our congregations, we can use strategies that are trauma-informed and resilience-building. And so health leaders are reaching out to congregations as they reached out to us, to schools, to state and local public health departments, social services, the criminal justice system. And there's even, in some states, there's even some legislation aimed at creating healing interventions. But remember, the most important healing intervention is the relationship. A quick recap of what those adverse childhood experiences are. There are 10. They're in 3 categories. The first category is abuse, emotional, physical, sexual. The second is household challenges, the domestic abuse in the home, violence in the home, substance abuse, mental illness, separation or divorce. How many children have experienced that? At the time of the first study, it was 23%. It's much higher now. Another household challenge was an incarcerated household member. Not present on this list of these 5 aspects of adverse experiences is homelessness. Isn't that interesting? It wasn't studied in that initial look at household challenges and adverse experiences. The final area is neglect, and that can be either emotional or physical. How common are adverse childhood experiences? Well, I told you that about a quarter of the public has experienced at least one adverse experience, one of those specific 10 adverse experiences in childhood. And only 38% have experienced none. 13% have experienced 2, 9% have experienced 3, and 16% have experienced 4 or more in childhood of these adverse experiences. And 4 or more almost guarantees early death, some kind of significant health problem like diabetes, high cholesterol, cancer, and also makes a person far more vulnerable to mental illness or other kinds of struggles that impair both physical and mental health. So, what is amazing is that part of the reaction of public health departments all across America has been, we need to know what's happening with people. We need to begin to survey people to find out about these adverse experiences. And in the first study, the only intervention they did was to give people a survey, has this ever happened to you? And then during the physical, when they came into Kaiser Permanente for the physical, where the Kaiser Permanente, where the study was conducted, they said, did any of those adverse experiences that you checked off have an effect on your life today as an adult? That was it. A few minutes of conversation. Now, of course, we have a much better understanding of the importance of relationship and what they call 5 healing gestures that are especially helpful to children who have experienced trauma, but they're also helpful to anyone who has experienced trauma. So let's talk about these 5 healing gestures, because in our faith community, in our church, at First Unitarian, it's not just about our structured ways of reaching out and caring and supporting people. It's also about the ways that we interact on a day-to-day basis with one another. Now, I'm going to say these 5 ways, and then I'm going to talk about each one. Celebrate. comfort, listen, collaborate, and inspire. I remember an amazing experience with a friend of mine. We'd met in Chicago for a short time. Karen is an incredible person. She instinctively does all of these 5 healing gestures pretty much all of the time. And she greets people who are complete strangers and immediately engages in them in conversation. It doesn't matter whether they're eating at the same restaurant or they're the waiter, or she's walking down the street and she sees someone who's obviously homeless and asking for money. She goes right in there and engages in conversation. She looks them in the eye. She hears their story. She tells some of her story. It's very hard to go down the street with Karen in 10 minutes. You know, it takes a much longer time. And I watched her as I knew she was like this, but I'd never actually had the experience of being out on the street with her like this. And I can't even count the number of people she spoke with in a meaningful way. What an amazing, and all of this was in service of celebrating what they had learned in their lives, what they had found out, who they were, the kind of good that they had. And she managed to find with everyone she spoke with smiled and talked about something good in their lives. So she was celebrating with them. It was really remarkable. Then I think about comfort. Now, we know that church is a place where you go and people who know you and care about you will comfort you when you're sad, when something has gone wrong, when there's been a loss. And when I first came here, one of the things people said to me again and again and again is that they felt that there wasn't enough systematic comforting going on, that they said, that's what a church does. I heard that phrase again and again. We've got to reach out to people who are homebound. We've got to be more consistent in making sure we connect with people who have experienced a loss or who are going through surgery or who are facing some other challenge. After the service, and if you go out to the caring ministry table, you'll see multiple caring cards that you can sign that then get mailed to people who are facing challenges or that celebrate with someone who has a joy. So sign those cards. It really makes a difference. But we also have a pastoral team now who connects with people. Over the first year of the pastoral team members supported about 80 members with in-home visits and follow-up phone calls and visits. Really, that's remarkable. We also have the caring ministry team, and there are people who will do the sign-up genius and volunteer to take a meal or give a ride to someone who's experiencing some challenges and needs that kind of concrete help. And that caring ministry team is astonishing because even though there's a leadership team of about 5 people, the actual team is the congregation. And there are probably 100 people who over the course of the year offer some kind of caring ministry help, concrete help, meals or rides, or a little phone call. And it's incredible to see the difference in the way people think about this church, just in this one area, just because we've taken some systematic steps to comfort one another. Listening. When my daughter, who's now a young adult, was about 4 years old, I'd come home from work and she was sitting on my lap and she was telling me about her day. And I guess I was a little distracted because, sometimes I do this when I'm thinking, and I was looking off and away, and she stopped the flow of her words, which had been so soothing, as I was not listening all that carefully, stopped. And she put her hands on my face, and she turned my face toward her, and she said, as she did that, she said, "Mommy, please turn your face to me." Whoa. Out of the mouths of babes. Turn your face to me. Listen. Make eye contact. Really participate in what's being said by listening to one another. And in our Soul Matters groups here, and our small group ministry group, and other kinds of small groups that connect people up in a meaningful way, that help people get to know one another, a lot of listening goes on. But we can have more listening. Listening just in the, sometimes the conversations in coffee hour, they're more about the weather than anything else. It might be possible just to kind of take a listening posture and put that attentive expression on the face, turn your face to someone, and just open the door to being a listener and see what happens. And I think one of the ways in which sometimes we could listen better to one another in a church community is when there's some important decision to be made, and instead of spending a lot of time actually asserting a position, we might try listening first and hearing what other people say. And I'm happy to remember that during the last set of budget forums, we had 3 of them, and I heard some awfully good listening going on. I witnessed some awfully good listening going on. Because yes, people were talking, they were saying what was important to them, but there were many people who were listening intently and with love and concern as they heard the perspective that was being shared. That's good listening, and I was really glad to see it. And collaborate. Collaborate's interesting. This is especially important with children and youth, because when we collaborate with them, that shows that we're listening, because it means what their point of view is matters to us. That's the whole idea of collaborate. It's not just top down. It's not just I say this is the way we'll do it and this is what we do, but it's a kind of conversation process of figuring out what we as a group, we as a church will do next. And working like that with children and youth is an especially healing and helpful thing to do. I remember an amazing thing that happened at one of the congregations I served. The youth wanted to raise some money for a project they were working on, and they wanted to have a kind of a band contest. And so they went to the music director with that idea. And the music director listened, and it turned out that there were 4 or 5 bands in the congregation, people actually playing in bands. It was a big congregation, about 700 members. And the music director had what I, to this day, think is an amazingly brilliant idea. He said, instead of having the bands that already exist play in this musical evening, we're going to draw names from a hat, so we create multi-generational bands, and you're going to rehearse for a few weeks, and then we're going to have this evening at which all of these pop-up bands will play. And it worked. It was amazing. The youth and the adults who might not have even known each other before collaborated. They had to figure out what songs to choose. It had to be songs that everyone in the band could play and wanted to play. And they had to figure out when to rehearse. It wasn't like it was the set time for choir rehearsal. They had to figure out their own times. That meant they had to collaborate over setting the schedule for rehearsal, because everybody has different obligations, and kids have different schedules from the kinds of schedules adults have. So it was an amazing multi-generational collaborative effort, and the music was absolutely great. And they raised about $20,000 for the youth activity. So yeah, just one evening. It was incredible. And the last one, the last healing gesture, is inspire. Now, I see this happening in every congregation I serve where we have the coming of age class, because that places each youth in a one-on-one relationship with a grown-up they might not have known before, who serves as their mentor, who talks with them as the year goes on, who helps them think about what they believe and what's meaningful to them in their lives. And that relationship, remember, the relationship is the healing intervention. That relationship becomes inspirational to those kids.